Academia is more than research output and publications. In this seminar series, we discuss the personal and social aspects of academic work that are not discussed enough. Welcome to Life in Academia.
Hello, everybody. I am Ghazal Shakiri, and welcome to Life in Academia, a series in which we want to kick all the unnecessarily stupid things in the groin. I am very happy that you joined us in this expected to be a great session. And a very, very special hello to our speaker, Rima Saini from Middlesex University, London. And today, Rima will discuss her research and praxis in the decolonisation of higher education. I cannot wait for Rima to tell us a bit more and for a lively discussion in the second half of the hour. So without further ado, Rima, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Ghazal, and thank you so much for inviting me here. This just seems like a great series, a great bunch of people, and you know, I have an idea already for a discussion point, may and may not be related to my slides, but I feel like this is a space where we can just share in the generalized anxiety and insanity of academia. And in the UK, we're definitely at that point right now. Everyone's striking everywhere I look. No one's doing any work. We're just complaining about work constantly, which is how I like it. So as Ghazal said, my name is Rima, Dr. Rima Saini. I'm a senior lecturer in sociology here at Middlesex University. I'm also a trustee of the British Sociological Association. My specialty is around sort of the sociology of race and the sociology of quantitative methods, so statistics, particularly how they are used within the social sciences and also in an interdisciplinary context. So hopefully there's stuff that you guys will find new and there's stuff that you might find familiar. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start talking. I might invite some questions or some thoughts at some point. Please do unmute and interrupt me or put things in the chat, whatever you prefer, whatever you like. And then I will stop talking at some point in about 25 minutes, 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have a discussion. So I have some slides. I'm just going to share these. Okay. And just sort of introduce the provocation or the topic for this particular talk. So I'm quite broadly framed this as sort of decolonizing knowledges in the social sciences. Let me just talk about sort of myself and how I fell into this. So I was a member of a consortium of quantitative method centres in the UK. This was around 9-10 years ago when I started my PhD. And these quantitative method centres were across 15 different UK universities. And the idea was, or the bright idea of the government was, we are having all of these students graduating in things like sociology and politics, in the arts and the humanities, and no one is getting jobs, or our government more so is not benefiting financially from the provision and the support of these humanities and social sciences degrees. And the whole idea essentially was, how do we generate more systematically skills of quantitative deduction and quantitative statistical analysis for these students taking these particular degree programs. And I was part of that first cohort of teachers or fellows who trialed these methods across cohorts of quantitative social science students at City University in London. It was a fantastic time. You know, it was great to teach quantitative methods, to teach statistics. I really loved it. I really enjoyed it. But I always felt that I occupied this really strange, complex, almost contradictory, almost hypocritical space, where on the one side, I was talking about how great and how useful numbers are to students who just wanted to sit there and read, or who just wanted to write essays. And on the other hand, I was delving into a lot of literature and reading a lot of literature around race and around decolonisation. Okay. And you might not think that these two portfolios of statistics and decolonisation are inherently imposed, But I'm going to sort of try and make the case as to why I'm a champion, I would say, perhaps, but definitely a practitioner and a proponent of a decolonial approach to generating knowledges in the social sciences, and specifically quantitative methods. And I'm going to draw on the work that I've done in the university around decolonisation, and why I think research methods, but particularly statistics, need decolonising. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about myself and my journey within this, which has not been easy at all for a number of reasons. Okay. So I've written a little bit on decolonisation in a few journals, and there are lots of definitions floating around out there. I'm sort of assuming that there is a self-selection bias effect to this meeting today, and most of you have some awareness or some knowledge around what decolonisation is. And these are the sorts of definitions that I float around and I use to define what I mean when I talk about decolonisation or decoloniality in a higher education context. The first thing I do whenever I'm doing workshops on this with staff, or I'm teaching this to my students, is you need to link decolonial praxis, which is decolonisation in practice, in your teaching, in your learning, with decolonial theory. And the theory really originated in Latin America. And it's around this idea of how can we sort of understand and de-link the colonial assumptions of knowledge production, particularly within colonized institutions. So these are the academic institutions that we work within, okay? So there's a range of definitions here, and they range from this idea of quite broadly unraveling colonial and imperial practices. And this can range from, you know, just having an all-white department when you have majority non-white, majority international cohorts of students, for example. It's about a Eurocentric curriculum, not drawing on the scholarship of scholars outside of the particular locality where you're teaching, to sort of more fundamental things like, should the university and the whole academic system be razed to the ground? Is it toxic primarily and purely because it's a neoliberal manifestation that's born out of a longer sort of colonial, imperial context within which universities were primarily there? And I went to a university that was primarily designed to train the next generation of colonizers, okay? And then there are lots of other authors that I've quoted here. Walter Mignolo, who is sort of one of the big daddies of decolonial theory. Priyamvada Gopal, who wrote that great book, Insurgent Empire, about who the real anti-colonialists were. In the context of empire, the British Empire in India. And Meena Sabaratnam, I think she's from SOAS, I believe, who has done a lot of work on decolonisation and decolonising the curriculum in politics. There are lots of other people, and there's lots of good work going on in the UK around this, particularly at places in UCL, where they're trying to really dive into the legacies of Francis Galton. And Francis Galton was our forefather, essentially, of quantitative methods of statistics, statistical analysis. And he was Charles Darwin's cousin, and he was a big proponent of eugenics, and UCL is trying to grapple with their history with that. Great efforts are being made. Is it all futile? Is one of the questions we can perhaps come back to later on. Okay, so I'm not being a pessimist here, I'm just trying to be critical. So, you know, I always preface the what it is with why we do it. Okay, and there's a range of different reasons why I think it's important to at least try, at least put the discussion on the table within higher education institutions. The first one is, you know, we need to address the elephant in the room, which is the inequalities, the racisms, the colonialisms that have formed the basis, as most practitioners of decolonisation would agree with, form the basis of the understanding of what the modern university is, how it functions, and what it's for. Okay, so we're not just talking about Oxford and Cambridge, where you walk into a room and you have portraits of old white men looking down on you and you realize, I don't belong here. But every single university is part of a system that's embedded with institutional inequalities and colonial legacies. And then what are the offshoots of that? You know, ideas around staff belonging, progression, inclusion, and minority staff belonging, progression, and inclusion. I am one of very, very few ethnic minorities who teach in my department, but we have over 50% of our student cohort international and non-white. Okay, so there is a real contradiction there. And it stares us in the face every day. And then it's about the knowledges, okay? And this is sort of what I'm passionate about in relation to statistical teachings, the teaching of statistics. You know, we often think, okay, look, we're in this really critical postmodern international globalized space now. All universities, you know, are little microcosms of the United Nations. Not quite, okay? We still prioritize scholarship and output from Eurocentric standpoints in English, largely from Western and Western European scholars. We often don't critique, we teach at length, but we often don't critique why this is the case. And I argue it's because we are still very much tied to this sort of binary philosophical idea about what knowledge is and what good knowledge is. And that is tied up within teachings of science and statistics as well, that we are these objective producers of good knowledge and facts. And the criticality of that is just not sufficient to address the fact that, well, numbers lie, people. And that needs to be taught, and that needs to be prefaced, as far as I'm concerned, in any good curriculum. And then this is the idea of higher education as a radical space. And I don't want to sound like my dad here, who's like, back in the 60s, blah, blah, blah. But back in the 60s, you know, higher education should be a radical space. This is not a controversial normative ideal. It should be a radical space, okay? And decolonisation, that movement that came out of South Africa, the movement that came out of the Oxford decolonisation movement, that's gained so much traction now globally, these were demands from students and academics themselves, and they need to be listened to, okay? I'm not going to focus on this slide a little bit too much, but I did a focus group with some of my colleagues last year, and I wanted to get a sense from them about how they understood decolonisation, because often I just thought I was this person coming in there and banging on about something that was a little bit esoteric, that was just Rima's being an ideologue again, you know, and something that was seen as a field of study in and of itself, but not as something to practically apply to your own praxis, your own pedagogy, okay? But so it was really great to see that me and my colleagues, a lot of us are on the same page about what decolonisation is, okay? So we often hear it's getting rid of something from the curriculum. It's not, it's about contextualising it, it's coming to terms with it, and it's thinking about how that relates to other forms of knowledge. So a lot of my students, for example, they learn about Marxism at school, and then when they come to university, I teach them about Black Marxism, and about how the Marxist radical tradition was not just a Western European radical tradition, it was a global radical tradition. And global scholars talked to and were in conversation with Western Marxists. So often it can be as simple as that, but obviously it's a lot more complex. Other colleagues of mine talked about it as being a political project, and it is, it's political and it's uncomfortable. I'm going to be saying things and doing things in this process that might make some scholars feel, you know, you're saying that I don't belong here, that I should be displaced. But it's not about that, essentially. It's about being mindful of the fact that, you know, we need to do more than pay lip service to diversity, okay? And that means diversity of knowledges, of ideas, and of people, and who the people are who teach, and what they look like and where they've come from and the experiences that they've had, okay? And if you think that, you know, and as a lot of my colleagues would think, okay, this is just a small cabal of us who are going in here and trying to mess things up and trying to raise down the institution. When I've tried to engage in sort of decolonial teaching with my students, and when I haven't, they notice, they absolutely notice. And these are some of anonymized comments from our students at Middlesex University. They have noticed things like the diversity of the teaching team. Okay, and my favorite comment is they always make sure we talk about diversity. That's pretty lit. But also noticing the teaching team is not ethnically diverse. We have international students who absolutely want to see their culture, not just in this sort of piecemeal, superficial way incorporated into the curriculum, but how do we think about methodology, for example, from an African or an Indigenous perspective? Okay, so not just having that 1 week or that one slide where we talk about Indigenous peoples, okay, but where do we give students and how do we give students the tool to engage in and understand what co-productive research is, for example. Okay, so not just going out there and researching people, but researching with them as co-producers. They notice when the curricula is Eurocentric, when it's inaccessible, okay? And they notice when they're consistently being presented with material that is partial, okay? So one of them has noted some of the modules presented only Western white males in their 50s. I'm not sure entirely what program this was speaking to, but I have a sense that it might have been a politics or a law curriculum. Okay. One of the key things I do is when I do workshops on this, when I'm talking about this work, when I'm trying to figure out with colleagues about what interventions we can make in our own teaching, I've given you a few examples of what I do. For example, I counter sort of more Eurocentric, more Western theories of, say, Marxism with what are the alternative or the counter kind of traditions that came out at that time in that space. I teach methodology from a perspective of indigeneity, African methodologies, as well as Western methodologies. But I also have to teach, and we also have to think about sort of what should we not be doing, or what should we not be conflating decolonisation with. So there was one initiative that we had where we, as a team in my department of sociology, put lots of different ideas for readings on a shared document. And these are readings that talk about race and sexuality and gender and decolonisation, all of these aspects from non-Western scholarship. And then the document sort of just sat there and we didn't really do much with it. And some people took bits out and putting on their reading lists and others didn't. And that first step, I think, is sort of what we might class as your classic kind of EDI approach to decolonisation. So it's the, accepting and encouraging differences among people, acknowledging those differences, trying to do something about it and trying to be inclusive, but it's not really getting to the heart of the matter, okay? And the heart of the matter is around knowledge production. It's also around racisms, embedded institutionalized racisms, and it's also about justice and inequity. So in making these interventions in our teaching and what we teach, we also have to think about how we're teaching. We also have to think about who is teaching. And I've said this a few times already, but I will say it again. You can't decolonize a curriculum, okay, if you don't have staff and people around you who are passionate about it and who have different life experiences and come from different places, okay? And that means you need a diverse workforce, all right? It's not like the diversity that we see in the UK government at the moment either, okay? So it's not lots and lots of brown people that look like me but want to get rid of all immigrants, okay? So it's people with diverse experiences but who will bring those diverse experiences in good faith to the table, okay? And understand and acknowledge the importance of having those diverse knowledges and those diverse perspectives, okay? So these are some of the institutional experience that I've had with doing EDI, which is sort of a necessary first step before we get to that more radical space, arguably. So this is engaging with syllabuses, core text, key theories, module design, engaging with critical non-Western scholarship, sort of thinking about some of the things that we do on a practical level, okay? So when you note when a student is writing unclearly, or their writing is encumbered or it's awkward, okay? Are we talking about their proficiency at writing, or are we criticizing their English language skills, for example, and having really honest discussions about that? And then it's around sort of being constructive and critical around EDI and pushing into that decolonisation space. Okay, so we're talking about how we normalize discussions of whiteness, colonialism, racism, structural privilege. It's about how this work is something that is shared between all of us. It has to be seen as a shared good. Okay. And understanding that, you know, we don't have all the answers. You know, I was born and brought up in the UK. All right. So I'm first generation university goer. But I was born and brought up in the UK. So, you know, I have the positionality and I have the knowledge of someone who works on issues of race and decolonisation and someone who is a racialized minority. I can't speak for international colleagues and I can't speak for international students. So we have to be reflexive and self-critical about that too. So I'm going to just invite some questions from you guys at this juncture before I sort of finish off in the last 10 minutes or so talking about statistics more specifically. But I want to know sort of where you guys are in your knowledge and your understanding of these sort of things, and whether any of the bullet points that I've got here are things that you have tried or things that you've discussed or things that you want to discuss with me right now. So opening up the floor and using this slide as a provocation.
Jump in if nobody wants to. Online people, you're also very welcome to jump in. To be honest, I try to embed decolonial practices in my teaching, and I do try to address whiteness and racism and structural inequalities, etc., whenever I teach. But at the same time, confession, I consider myself as a white presenting person who, funnily enough, was not born in Germany, was born in a fairly unknown Central Asian country that has not been part of any colonial activities. So I often feel awkward, I want to say, about talking about decolonizing things if I have no history linking me to colonialism. So I think this is a really weird barrier I have that probably doesn't exist, to be honest. I just made it up in my mind, and then now it's keeping me from being more active about it. Yeah, that's all I can say for this.
That's really interesting. Does anyone have any sort of thoughts on that, or similar sort of yeah, go on.
Yeah, I don't. Okay, it surprised me that you don't consider yourself as yeah. you consider yourself as a white person. You mean
white presenting?
White presenting.
Because
okay.
I did most of my growing up in Germany, so I do consider myself. As I mean, we moved here when I was 6 years old. I did Christmas, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's very important point also. Who is presenting? Who is defending decolonializing? It's a general point, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I know you. I know your origin, and I know a little bit about your story. And I think it's in somehow it's sometimes it's difficult for people to define themselves, to position themselves in which where they are, and yeah, I think it's good to do this process, but I think also to have this discussion and this reflection. All people are needed, of course. The people who yeah, let's say the Black people and the people who yeah, suffering from colonization and so on, they have to be the leader and make things change, but they have to be also they have to have also ally from other people. I think it's very important.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those points are really valid, and I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of, you know, these discussions need to be had, and they can be uncomfortable. And you might not have any resolution then about what that means for you and your own teaching and your own research, but it's important to have them, I think, because personally, I feel as if everyone is implicated in these issues. You know, we might think, okay, some people who have certain positionalities do benefit, but I think overall, because academia is such a collective endeavor, okay, ever since Brexit happened and we've lost our research opportunities with Europe, and I've seen my European colleagues and my European students my own sister sort of like move away, mainly to Germany. You're stealing everyone. You know, I realize that we need each other and we are implicated in each other's fates. That makes us implicated in each other's histories as well. Okay. And I fundamentally believe that, you know, if we can create spaces and create academia as a space that is radical, that is fundamentally equal, where people feel as if they have a chance to, you know, to find out about real history, to know real things. And by real things, I mean sort of, you know, from that sort of critical, hidden, invisibilized perspective, and that everyone has a chance to be a part of that conversation. I think that's for the better, and that's regardless of your background and regardless of your positionality. So there was another hand up from Patricia. Oh, and another one there as well from, was it ERB?
Yeah, but Patricia was first.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. I just wanted to say something about the point where, like, just now, I think Michael, I'm not sure, said that kind of like the movement has to come from the people of color, and I very much disagree with that, because I think we cannot just sit back and be like, it's not about me, so I'm just going to leave all the talking to other people, because we put all the burden on the people that have already been ignored so far. And I don't think that's the right way. I think we have to kind of start the conversations and get everyone in and kind of be like, we see this as a problem. Now tell us what you think we could do about it. But I very much don't think that we should leave the burden on people that have been ignored so far. Yeah.
Yeah.
Rebuttal.
So I didn't want to kind of, that is just that kind of struck out at me when you said that.
Yeah,
so
okay. Maybe it's maybe I don't formulate that so well enough. I think actually that's it's, I don't mean that the people that the privileged people don't initiate the discussion and so on, but I just have in mind some situations where white people, white men are speaking about decolonization, and they are the ones, or they are the people who are talking all the time and taking too much space and so on. That was the background of this formulation. I mean, nice to have people who have more expertises in this field, that they have the lead, and that they define also the requirements, what we want in this moment, what we don't want, and so on. There is the background of
no, with that I very much agree. I mean,
okay.
We cannot talk about the things that we haven't experienced, really, but I think that it's still our responsibility to kind of push this conversation and kind of like get the people in to talk about that.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And I think we had another question.
Yeah, from me or from other one?
I think it's from you.
From me. Okay, I have one. I would like to report about something and have also a question. I'm sorry if I take too much time.
No, go for it. We've got
yeah, the first point is that we have here media processing as a lecture, and we have it was in one situation we have projects from students, and I am not really courageous. I don't say things, but I say, okay, if I say that, then people think I am too radical and I have to tell them. And in this project, I told the people, please take, they develop something that try to recognize hands of people. And I told him, please take into consideration that there are also other colors, hand colors and so on. And the people were really thankful, and they repeat that all in the whole semester, that they have another data set now with other different things. And also they were really creative and developed another solution that is not based on color. They worked without the color of the hand doesn't make any role. And I was really proud of that. And the question that I have is, actually, how do you integrate decolonizing discussion in your teaching? Because the background that I have is we have also this kind of resistance. A lot of people resist to give up privileges, to recognize that they have privileges, so that there are some decolonized. And I would like to hear from you. What is your strategy?
Yeah. I mean, that's such a great question. And I think the example that you gave, and some of the reading I'm doing at the moment is around sort of ethics and bias in sort of algorithmic data, in machine learning, in big data. We're seeing it everywhere in the news now. And it's because these, every single process, every single system that is designed by a human being, and we are human beings, and we are we're racist, we're racializing, and it's something that we're all having to unlearn. It's easier for those of us who are racialized, negatively racialized ourselves, to unlearn that. It's quicker and it's easier for us. But these are the examples, these are the practical examples, and we have plenty of them. Okay, we've got the facial recognition technology in the UK, for example, a lot of that's used by the police, a lot of that's used by the Home Office, for example, by anyone who needs to check your face, to check your right to work, for example, often doesn't notice dark skin colors. And so there are plenty of examples out there where we can use trial and error. And that is a process in itself of decolonization, but it's very slow. It's trial and error. It takes time. And essentially it's reactive. It's not proactive. Okay. What I do, though, is I talk about to my colleagues, particularly the implications of what there are if we don't have a decolonial curriculum. The implications can be really dire when it comes to the fate of a Black person in a hospital, or the fate of a Black person at the hands of the police or the Home Office, for example. But the implications are far-reaching. And I've often thought I can win people over with theory. Doesn't always work. I can teach theory. I can't always win people over with theory. And I've had colleagues say to me, well, I don't really see that you're teaching us anything beyond just another theoretical perspective on life. Okay. And I may or may not disagree with it. So I lead through the very real implications and the very real histories of colonialism and of institutionalized racism. So I would say sort of those are the things that I use, and sort of evidence and data are what I really use to convince people, essentially, and to get people on my side. But there are some people you just can't win over, and that itself is a machination of privilege and of whiteness. And through many uncomfortable workshops and uncomfortable Q&As and back and forths with colleagues, I have just had to at some point say, I have to live and let live, because you've got to look after yourself in this process as well. Okay. So some battles cannot be won, essentially, is the second part of that answer, the slightly more pessimistic answer to it. I don't know if I fully answered your question, but I might just move on and give some of those examples that I was talking about. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So let me just go back to my slides. All right. So these are some of the examples that I use in terms of how I decolonize when I teach sociology, when I teach politics. These are very specific to my discipline, so I won't go into them in too much detail. But what I do with my first year students is I almost don't give them the opportunity to learn things the Eurocentric way. I go straight in there week one, and I teach them about Southern theory and global theory, and I teach them about examples from the global South as well as the global North. I never give them binary definitions of anything. I try to not always talk about, say, qualitative and quantitative, mainstream or classical view and alternative view. I try to avoid using those binaries and those paradigms, because these are also Eurocentric conceptions. When we categorize and when we codify the philosophy of what we do, when we classify and codify who we are as people and as groups, that is a Eurocentric and that is a colonial strategy. So I go in there and I teach things in as reflexive and as critical a way as I possibly can, okay? Because we don't know, but for centuries, we have been socializing them into one way of thinking and one way of learning, and some partial bias types of scholarships. And also about understanding the discomfort, the messiness, the inconsistencies of all of these things as well, okay? So one of the things that my students find really difficult to grapple with is this idea that, you know, okay, so the Europeans enslaved groups of people, but how did they do that all by themselves? You know, how did a small group of Europeans control whole swathes and parts of the world? And the uncomfortable truth is, well, there had to be buy-in from indigenous peoples as well. Okay, so we have to talk then about how slavery was a collaborative effort across those from European and non-European people. Okay, that sort of destabilizes our idea and understanding often of, you know, whiteness and blackness. But these are the nuances and complexities of historical events that we have to teach, because it's the reality, and it's about throwing that messiness and that inconsistency at our students and allowing them to debate and grapple with that as well. And just a little briefly now about research methods, specifically in decolonisation. So I mentioned before, I go into my class term 1, week 1, and I teach my students, I'm like, look, there are some types of methods to analyse number, there are some types of methods to analyse pictures and words. These two things aren't mutually exclusive. There is not a binary here, okay? And I like to show them that numbers can be as biased as words and vice versa, all right? So this is not something that is part and parcel of the syllabi of research methods in UK universities. There might be an odd module or a course here and there nowadays around it, but it's not really the core of how we teach the philosophy and the practice of research methods. And I see us year in year reproducing students who try and make their research as robust and as objective and as neutral as they possibly can, without really thinking, is this achievable and what do we mean by objectivity and neutrality? Okay, so one of the things I'm doing at the moment is trying to develop a curriculum where the idea of Eurocentric binaries, of good and bad research, of objective and subjective, of neutral and biased, where we break that down and we build that into the way that we teach research methods to social science students. And we also teach students a little bit about how academia works, okay? And where the money goes and where the money flows, and where most of this research takes place. In the UK, it's largely with our Russell Group universities, with Oxford and Cambridge. And these tend to be elite organizations. These are the most quintessentially colonial academic institutions in the country. And they tend to have the most privileged students domestically and around the world. Okay, so a lot of it is about breaking down assumptions, and a lot of it is about demystifying research and demystifying the academe for our students who may end up carrying out research themselves. All right. And quantitative methods, that's my bag right now. That's really what I'm interested in. Okay. Particularly survey methods, quantitative survey methods, and the ways in which we frame and we categorize people in those survey methods. So one of the things I do with my students is I teach them, look, you know, for practical reasons, we have to categorize men and women, Black, white, Asian, Middle Eastern groups in these surveys. But why are we doing this? And what are the potential net harms that we're perpetrating by reproducing this idea that we can and should understand groups in this really categorical top-down way, okay? And I use examples of the ways in which in colonial India, for example, groups that didn't fit into binary and Western understandings of male and female, we might consider them trans nowadays, were criminalized. Okay, so how statistics don't only invisibilize, but they control and criminalize groups. And then I bring them back to their own survey data collection initiatives, projects that they're doing. And I ask them to really think hard about what they want to find out why and what the best way to do that is. And sometimes it's about acknowledging that, We have to use crude categories. And sometimes it's about acknowledging, well, maybe we're better off actually talking to people on the ground and dealing with it in a more sort of open-ended, qualitative way. Okay. So these are the kind of things that I'm trialing out, and I'm looking at embedding not just within my classroom, but within every classroom in the UK where quantitative methods and survey methods are taught. Okay. So how do we frame groups? Why do we do it? How do you feel perhaps as a member of a marginalized group being shoved into a little box, maybe the other white box? I don't know what they have in Germany, but we have a lot of boxes within our surveys that say things like white, other, or other white. And then also thinking about sort of big data and large scale data as well, and who's collected that data, why have they collected it? Is it representative in a really meaningful decolonial sense? What groups are not represented in that data and why, for example? Okay. I'm just going to finish a couple of minutes now just talking about some of the problems and issues I've had. So I mentioned before in relation to that question, we can't win everyone over, and we shouldn't even win everyone over, because this is an ongoing messy debate. It's a project, it's an initiative, it's a radical form of sort of ongoing everyday activism. But there are some specific things that I've come across that are really problematic. And I don't know whether these are things that you've also seen in your institution, and we can have a chat about that. So I feel really uncomfortable about doing this for myself rather than for my students a lot of the time. I know I'm from a marginalized background in academia, but it's really important for me that the students benefit or lead this work in some way. Okay. So it's always important to involve them and ask them about whether they understand what this project is about of decolonisation and why they think it's important and what it means for them. Okay, so locating yourself and locating your students in that work. And it really, really means that you've got to be brave. Okay, you've got to risk your reputational identity a lot of the time, because you have to challenge management. You have to challenge neoliberalism as part of what you're doing. Okay, so recently I was asked, I'm not going to say their name, I was asked by a senior colleague, we're going for an award in our department, will you come and do a workshop on decolonisation? So maybe that's a question for you guys. Why do you think I said no in that scenario? We're going for an award, we need you to help us decolonize.
Yeah, it's just, I feel I would have said you're just exploiting my labor and pretending to represent diversity, etc., or open-mindedness.
Yeah, any other ideas as to why I said no?
Well, it doesn't sound like that as to actually get change. It's just like to share, we talk about that. So it doesn't sound like the real goal is like really get a change in.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, you're both right. It was for all of those reasons. But also, and the fact that, you know, I'm an expert in this in my field as well. I'm not an expert in this in economics or business or whatever. So I love having a conversation with people about that, but I'm not going to teach you about what changes need to be made to your disciplines, because that would mean God knows how much extra work for me and immersing myself in the field and doing things that I'm not situated appropriately to do given my knowledge base. But also it's this idea that, you know, again, that the ends justify the means, you know, that this is some sort of lip service exercise, and you can then have a decolonized curriculum that can then go up for an award. This work has to be inherently valuable in and of itself. And then there's a lot of sort of, the other stuff is like, you know, reducing it to issues of identity politics or race. Okay, so we had this conversation, didn't we, about who should and who can be leading this work. A lot of it is about our positionality, but it's not just a case of, you know, uplifting scholars of color for a short amount of time or spotlighting them or giving them this extra thing to do. And a lot of that is because of the neoliberal way that we work in the academy, isn't it? You know, it's about what can I do for myself? The university is thinking, what can we do to increase our funding, to increase our recruitment, and so on and so forth. And you have to not only get out of that mode of thinking, but you have to actively challenge anyone who tries and fits decolonisation within that rubric. But it's difficult because we are employees and beneficiaries of the academy. So that's my next provocation, I guess. And I'm going to stop sharing here so we can have more of an open discussion.